Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming out this morning for our monthly Tread Talk. We are honored to have with us this morning Dan Minick. Dan's a familiar face to many of you here at the museum. If you don't know from the museum, maybe you know from K-State where he teaches in the business department. But Dan's been with our museum from the very beginning. He's one of our volunteers on Saturday afternoons. He's on our Museum Collection Advisory Board and just does an awesome job. This is Sherry's his wife back here. And so between the two of them, they spend a lot of time here at the museum. So we thank the Minick family for all their dedication to us. Dan has a love for just about any type of car, but he's got a real passion for European cars. And a little over a year ago, he came to me and showed me a picture of this car that was for sale in Chicago. He said, "Doug, the museum really needs this." And I looked at it, and I'll be honest, my passion really isn't too much of these. It's more of the other kinds of classic cars. Like I said, look, a Volkswagen Golf, you know, or a Chevette or something. He goes, no, you need to know the whole story of this car. So Dan being Dan sent me like a 12-page dissertation of the Lancia. And after I read through it, I thought, well, that is pretty amazing. And so we ended up, Dan and a couple of our team members flew up to Chicago to look at the car. And the result is, here it is, sitting in here. So Dan, you won that one. But I'm glad you did, because it's an amazing car. He's going to tell you all about it here in a minute. Now, what I knew about these cars was very limited. I knew they were incredibly small, like I said, like a VW Golf. I knew they were incredibly fast. I also knew that the fans of these cars were incredibly stupid because they line up along the course when these cars are zipping around these gravel roads and they get hit, they get killed, they get ramrod. You know, it's really kind of scary to watch, but they have a good time. But it's an amazing story. The whole road rally culture is just an amazing thing. It's really coming to become a popular thing with a lot of enthusiasts wanting these cars now. We're very fortunate to have this one. So anyway, I'm going to quit talking. I'm going to let Dan talk because he's going to really tell you a lot about this car and all the fun it is. So let's give Dan a warm welcome.
Thanks. I'm going to start out here with a quick video. So that's it rallying, not this specific car. But now for the backstory on what is this, because most people in the US don't know this car unless you're really into rallying, or don't even know the company Lancia. So the original story, way back, Vincenzo Lancia, born in 1881, and this is like a lot of automakers, auto designers back in the day. They wanted to play with mechanical stuff. Cars were a new thing. His father said, you should really study bookkeeping instead. And so they kind of made a compromise, and he started working at a bicycle company as the bookkeeper. Well, he was seldom seen out of his overalls. He was more hanging out in the mechanical side of the shop instead of doing the bookkeeping. And at that time, when he was working for Cirano Bicycle Company, it was then sold to Agnelli's motor car company, Fabbrica Italiana Automobilia Torino. My pronunciation is probably terrible there, but or as it came to be known by its acronym, FIAT, or Fiat. And so Lancia had the confidence of Giovanni Agnelli at Fiat, and they began a racing program for publicity. And Vincenzo was one of the key drivers for the Fiat racing program there. And they had a very successful racing program. And Lancia was world famous by 1907 as a race car driver, especially in Europe. Probably not so much in the US, but well known over there. And being a mechanical guy, he had the bug, as most auto tinkerers did back then. I'm going to start my own auto company, which he did in 1906. He registered his own auto company, and the first Lancia was in 1907, and he decided he's going to name his cars after the Greek alphabet. And so the first car was a Lancia Alpha in 1907. Pretty typical of the era, brass fittings, open touring car. Here's a 1913 Lancia Theta. This had a built-in electrical system that had lights and electric starter. This was kind of a big first in Europe. I believe US was maybe a little ahead of the curve on that, but Lancia was the first in Europe to have a complete electrical system built in. And I'm just going to kind of hit a couple of prominent cars throughout Lancia's history, but in 1922, the Lambda arrived, and this was revolutionary for the time. It's low slung. It had the first unibody chassis of any car, which is a monocoque construction. Most everything was still body on frame, even decades after that. The first V4 in an automobile production car, one of the first integrated trunks, and front independent suspension, which most things had solid axle at that time. Here's a photo of the unibody chassis, what it looked like. Here is the built-in trunk, and this was revolutionary for its day. By 1930s, Lancia changed his strategy from using Greek letters to starting with Italian place names, starting with A. A lot of nationalist pride was going on in the 1930s in Europe. Mussolini was, big on Italian pride and nationalism, and so let's kind of capitalize on Italian place names and heritage. The V4 Augusta, the V4 Artena, the V8 Astura with our famous Italian leader in the back and his German buddy riding beside him there in a Lancia Astura. The late 1930s, the Aprilia was launched. This was a small family car, something frugal, able to transport 5 adults in comfort, unibody still, that was a Lancia thing, 4-wheel independent suspension, V4, no B-pillar, one of the first cars ever designed in a wind tunnel in the 1930s, collaborating with Battista Farina, who we later know as Pininfarina. This was the last car with input from Vincenzo Lancia. And there's side view, very 1930s kind of Art Deco Airstream design, no B-pillar, which was kind of a Lancia thing for the next 10, 20 years. And a rear view of the Aprilia. The Ardea was a smaller version of that. The smallest V4 ever in a production car, 900 cc, pretty small. But it was also the first ever mass-produced car to have a 5-speed transmission, which again, another Lancia first that they had. In 1937, Vincenzo dies at age 55, and his widow Adele and his son Johnny take over, and Johnny is essentially leader of the company from that point on. In the 1940s, work was started on extending their existing V4, which was a pretty common, what Lancia was using was a V4 motor in a lot of their vehicles, in transforming that into a V6. They increased the angle between the cylinders and to 60 degrees, and it made its public debut in 1950 at the Trend Motor Show as the Aurelia B10. Again, unibody, no B-pillar. This was the first production car ever to be fitted with a V6. You know, I know here in the US we tend to think of V6s as, you know, something fairly new, at least, you know, 50 years ago, but this is early 1950s, and Lancia had the first to be a, you know, have a car with a V6. Farina took the Aurelia sedan and designed both a coupe and a convertible. This is the B20 coupe, which was famous in racing in the 1950s, and the convertible, the B24 convertible. So a little side story on this Aurelia coupe and convertible. Growing up as a kid, my father worked on a lot of interesting vehicles at his farm shop here in the middle of Kansas, and we had an Aurelia B20 coupe and a B24 convertible sitting at my dad's farm shop for years that he did various work on. And it was a ride in a B24 convertible when I was probably 10, 11 years old that probably warped my sense of automotive appreciation, I think. That's probably an influencer in why I like what I like, I think. So anyway, that's kind of a personal note, my interest in the Lancia brand. So anyway, Johnny, son of Vincenzo, decides, you know, company, let's go into racing. And the Aurelia Coupe GT here on the right was the first step in racing. The next step was a purpose-built racing car, kind of loosely designed after the Aurelia using its V6, the D20 there in the center, space frame, and Lancia's third victory in the Targa Florio. Next was a D24, and if you know anything about 50s racing, the Carrera Pan America down in Mexico was a huge racing event numerous years in the 50s. And in 1953, Lancia won first, second, and third in their class in the Carrera Pan America. Second place in the Sebring 12-hour. The Aurelia B20 won the GT class in the Giro de Sicilia. Driver Ascari won the Mille Miglia. They were the 1954 winner of the Targa Florio. So Lancia was on a roll and really big in racing. And the next step is they're ready for Formula One. And they designed the D50. This was the only opposition feared by Mercedes in Formula One in the 1950s. And one unique feature about this, the comment here about every suspension mounting was machined to aeronautical tolerances. The fuel tanks are on the side, those kind of pods. Those are the fuel tanks. And prior to this, most fuel tanks were in the rear on Formula One. As you used up the fuel, that changed the weight distribution front to rear. Having the tanks on the side like this kept weight consistent even as you used fuel. And so this was kind of a unique design, and Lancia was feared in Formula One at this point. Ascari, who was a key auto racer driver in the 1950s, he's twice world champion. He qualified as D50, won Grand Prix at Turin and Naples, but then at Monaco in 1955, he fatally crashed into the harbor. And costs for racing were too much for the company, and so at that point, Ascari's death and some financial issues at the company kind of was a sign, I guess, to Gianni and his mother, and they make the decision to sell the company. The racing program is turned over to Ferrari, and in 1956, Fangio, which may be a familiar name to you, won the Formula One world title in 56 with a D50A Lancia Ferrari, which Ferrari is now running the Lancia-built D50s. There are only 2 original D50s that have survived in the world. This example here is actually on display in Naples, Florida at the Revs Institute, one of 2 in the world left from that era. So Johnny and his mother sell the company to Carlo Pacenti of Ital Cementi, who is a successful businessman in Italy, has a construction cement company. Johnny also had planned a corporate tower here for Lancia, which that building still exists today, not as a Lancia building, but in Turin. And I've heard, but I cannot find proof of it, that Pacenti of Ital Cement was one of the contractors, vendors on this building, and money was owed to him as well, and so a deal was struck. I can't prove that for a fact, but there may be connections there. So anyway, Pacenti is now running the company. Meanwhile, some show cars here from Farina. Pininfarina took the Aurelia and designed a couple of prototype show cars called the Florida Coupe and the Florida Sedan, and these were phenomenal for their time. Prior to this, most cars were what they call pontoon shaped. You know, you had kind of the fenderless side. Think of like a 49 Ford or a Packard from that era, or Nash, you know, this kind of rounded side. Pininfarina kind of really crisped up styling on this, and I'll come back to this slide here in a minute, but it actually goes into production as the Lancia Flaminia Coupe and the sedan. Now, this was influential in auto design for the next decade or 2, easily. There's a couple key things that are, let me point out here. So this little crease right here, this is called the Pininfarina crease, and this was the first time any designer had done that. Also, the parallelogram C-pillar here, essentially parallel lines, and a recessed rear window. Where does this show up in auto design? Stuff you all are familiar with. On the left, Lancia Flaminia Coupe. On the right, 63 Pontiac Grand Prix. You've got the Pininfarina crease, the parallelogram window C-pillar there. Bill Mitchell loved that Florida Coupe. Bill Mitchell at General Motors, and copied that design almost shamelessly. First generation Chevelle, Pininfarina crease. Second generation Corvair, Pininfarina crease. First generation Camaro Firebird, same thing. We've got the recessed rear window. That came from the Florida concept on a second generation Chevelle. Ford really copied the C-pillar, widened it a little, 57 Ford retractable, and then the 58 and later T-Birds, and the recessed rear window, which was inspired by this as well, both on Fords. So American design really owes to this Lancia Florida concept from Farina. Early 60s, Lancia introduces a Flavia, a 4-cylinder boxer engine, front-wheel drive here on the top, and the Fulvia sedan and coupe, which this coupe will become to be known quite well here in the next few years after this. I want to take a side note here. The red elephant and the HF, and if you'll notice on this Delta here on the front grille, there's a little HF badge with the red elephant right here, just like this. Where does this come from? This is a Lancia thing. In the 50s, one of the race drivers had used this little red elephant logo as a good luck symbol. It's a good luck symbol in Eastern countries, India specifically. An elephant with an outstretched trunk running is just kind of a symbol for good luck. Johnny Lancia saw that and thought, hey, I like that, let's put that on all our race cars. And it's also said that Johnny said, oh, once an elephant starts running, you can't stop it. So, that was kind of his thing for a racing program. The HF comes from, there was a club called the High Fidelity Club for repeat Lancia owners. And you got in the club if you bought so many Lancias, you got a newsletter, and it was kind of a thing. When Lancia withdrew from racing in '55, the elephant kind of disappeared, but it came back in the '60s when Lancia gets back into rallying, along with that HF, which is used to kind of signify a high performance version. But that's the roots of, you'll see that on numerous launches throughout in racing, HF and the elephant. So in '63, Lancia decides to return to racing, but this time it's rallying rather than Formula One and the high-end stuff. So they begin to have class wins with the Fulvia Coupe, and this is V4 front-wheel drive, small car, and you'll also see we've got the HF with the elephants here on the side. And so they begin to have numerous wins with this Fulvia. Meanwhile, back at corporate, financial issues again, and a lot of these cars that Lancia had developed were technically advanced, expensive to build, profits not there. They hit their greatest sales to this point in 1967, 43,000 cars. Fiat, by comparison, built 1.2 million in a year. And so Lancia is a small potatoes company. I mean, they're not a big player, but company is financially essentially insolvent by this point. Ford is interested. And if you've ever seen, Ford versus Ferrari, Ford failed at acquiring Ferrari. So Ford thinks, hey, here's another Italian sports car company. Let's see if we can get them. And the Italian government says, no, we don't like the idea of American-owned company like Lancia. So they twist Fiat's arm and say, Fiat, why don't you take this over? And so in 1969, Fiat acquires Lancia for 1 Italian lira and assumes all debt. So Lancia is part of the Fiat camp by this point, but rallying is still continuing, and the Fulvia wins the Italian Rally Championship 8 out of 9 years. Between '65 and '73, they won every year but 1970. And in 1972, they win the IMC, which is essentially a forerunner of today's WRC, World Rally events. It wasn't called WRC at that point, but it's essentially the same event. And they win that championship in '72 by a significant margin. And so Lancia is kind of on top of the world in rallying at this point. And they feel like, okay, this Fulvia this is a 10, 11, 12-year-old car design. We need something new if we're going to be serious about rallying. And so let's design something dedicated specifically for rallying. And they launch the Stratos HF. And if you've ever seen one of these, they are tiny. They are short, they're low, and it's designed specifically for rallying. It is mid-engined using a Ferrari Dino V6, and it weighs about 2,000 pounds. And race-prepped ones are about 200 pounds lighter with a Ferrari V6 in it. And so that thing is insanely quick. The Stratos scored its first win and then won WRC title 3 times in a row, '74, '75, and '76. They were the WRC winner 3 years in a row. Between '74 and '81, Stratos took 18 first place wins. And again, we've got a little HF with elephants on the side here. With Fiat in control now, Lancia goes back to this old Greek alphabet naming scheme. And they launched numerous vehicles, the Lancia Beta, the Gamma, the Delta, which we'll talk about here, the Beta Monte Carlo. And when they sold this in the US, even though Lancia had won Monte Carlo Rally numerous times, they didn't have rights to the Monte Carlo name in the US. Someone else did. And so they called it the Scorpion when they sold it in the US. That is actually a mid-engine car with somewhat similar motor to what this Delta has here. In '79, Fiat launches for Lancia a small competitor to the Golf. Small, compact, front-wheel drive, 4-door hatchback, designed by Giugiaro. And Giugiaro designed the original Golf, the original Scirocco, the DeLorean, the Isogrifo. I mean, Giugiaro has a whole list of auto designs to his credit, designed this. Decent enough small little compact sedan, 4-wheel independent suspension, the Lampredi design, Fiat overhead cam motor, and Delta wins the European Car of the Year award in 1979 in Europe as a decent competitor to the Golf. In rallying, the Stratos had kind of run its course. They're always upping the game in rallying. And Abarth, which is also part of the Fiat group, collaborated with Lancia in developing this 037. They basically took some hard points of the Monte Carlo / Scorpion and turned it into a dedicated rally car called the 037. And it had space frame as well, using some of the sheet metal points of the Monte Carlo Scorpion. They realized there wasn't room for drivers with helmets, so they did this bubble roof, essentially punched 2 holes in the roof and did a double bubble, which was kind of an Abarth thing as well. The 037 competed in Group B. And just an aside, if you're familiar with rallying at all, Group B was a serious rallying class in the 1980s. It became dangerous. 037 was rear-wheel drive. It competed against Audi Quattro, which was all-wheel drive. The Lancia 037 won the 1983 WRC manufacturer's title, beating Audi, which most people thought it couldn't, but it did. This was actually the last rear-wheel drive car to win WRC wins. Everything else has gone all-wheel drive for general stuff. Follow-up to the 037 was what they called the Delta S4. This is called a Delta, looks a little similar to a Delta, but shared absolutely nothing. This had a tubular space frame, was mid-engined, all-wheel drive, turbocharged and supercharged, the first vehicle to ever do that, capable of between 500 and 600 horsepower in a car that weighed under 2,000 pounds. Street version, Stradale, to qualify. So to race, you had to build 200 in Group B. You're supposed to build 200. It's more likely that fewer than 100 were ever built of a S4. There are a few S4s still out there around, pretty rare, pretty sought after to this day. So the S4 won its first event with Henri Tovinen as a driver here in 1985. In '86, they had 3 wins for the S4. Tovinen won the Monte Carlo. Group B was becoming much more dangerous. Group B was kind of a no-holds-barred rally racing. And just as an aside, if you want to know more about Group B in the 80s, there's actually a documentary called The Killer Years, which is kind of interesting to watch, see how dangerous Group B was. Spectators getting killed, drivers getting killed is just insane. The 1986 Portuguese rally, which this is actually on, there's video clips of this actually happening. Driver Santos crested a hill, turned right to avoid spectators, and then lost control. He was in a Ford RS200, but then slid into another crowd, injuring 31, killing 3 people. If you've seen, and you saw that opening footage there of rally racing, it's kind of like, I don't know, European hillbillies at their finest. You're, you're standing on the side of the road, and the thing is, there's almost this, you want to reach out and try and touch the car as it goes by. That's just kind of a thing. I don't know why, but you can see that's a recipe for disaster. And especially in Group B, when you had 500-600 horsepower cars, less than 2,000 pounds, not a safe thing. In 1986, Tour de Corsica, narrow, very twisty, mountainous rally event on the island of Corsica. Tovinen had a sore throat and the flu, insisted on driving, and then he complained that the S4 is too fast and too powerful for this race in Corsica. On the second leg, Tovinen's S4 went off on a tight left corner, no guardrails, typical European roads. Vehicle burst into flames. Tovinen and Cresto died instantly. There wasn't much left of the vehicle. Within hours, FISA had banned Group B for the next year. They said, okay, Group B, we're done. this is just too insane, too crazy. And the planned Group S was canceled. Audi and Ford withdrew immediately, said no more racing this year even, we're done. And so Group B is dead in rallying. So what's left is Group A, which wasn't kind of the fun race. It was kind of more production cars. You know, it's not as insane or intense. So Group B had all the glory, but Group A is still left. So many manufacturers didn't have anything suitable. And you had to have a minimum of 2,500 of whatever you raced built to sell to the public. And you know, a lot of manufacturers kind of said, well, no, that's, we're not doing that. And so Lancia goes, well, we got this Delta. Let's see what it can do. And so pretty mild-mannered looking golf competitor, they decided to race it for 87. And they had a four-wheel drive version, the Lancia HF four-wheel drive. Wheel arches were restrictive, wheels and brakes were too small, suspension didn't have enough travel. I mean, you can see, you know, you're launching the car and doing a lot of jumps and all kinds of crazy stuff. Torque split was split more to the front. It's front-wheel drive based, but it still had some advantages over its rivals. And so Lancia actually wins the manufacturer's title for 1987, and Ken Coonan takes the driver's championship. Alain loses first place for driver. He rolls his car, which you saw that in that opening video. That was actually Alain rolling his vehicle there around that one corner. He came out fine from that though. But anyway, so Lancia wins in 87 with this car that, we didn't think it was that great, but it did okay. We won. And so for 88, they say, okay, well, let's get serious about this. Let's start beefing up this car. And so they launched the Integrale 8-valve. And what they did was they widened the track by about a little over 3 inches, put some wheel arches on the side, new 6-speed gearbox, lowered the weight, reinforced some suspension components, and they dominate the season, win 10 out of 11, have 10 wins out of 11 in the Manufacturers Series. They take the Manufacturers and the Drivers' Championship second year in a row. And so 89, they do some further developments. They come up with a 16-valve head, dual overhead cam now, bulge on the hood to accommodate the new head. Torque split is now shifted and it's biased more towards the rear. 4753. Martini Racing, who had been the racing sponsor, came out with new colors for 89, red, which was the only year they really had the red livery on that. Little under 300 horsepower. Biasen wins the Drivers' Championship second time in a row, and the Delta wins the manufacturer's title for the third time in a row. So for 89, they keep going, don't make a lot of changes for the vehicle for 90. And at the Rally to Portugal, and this is kind of a phenomenal event, that 4 Deltas came in the top 4 places. So you had, you know, the 3 people on the podium, the 3 driver teams had all 3 places were Lancia Deltas, and even the 4th place was Lancia Delta. They win the manufacturer's title a 4th time in a row. The drivers' wins were split between, you know, 3 different drivers' teams, and Toyota actually took the drivers' championship that year. But manufacturer's title, this is the 4th time in a row for a vehicle to win World Rally event. In 1991, they say, okay, let's get even more serious. And they create what's called the Evoluzione, which is what this is here, the street version of that. Italians call it the Deltona, which means the big Delta. So remember, they had widened the track for the Integrale by about 3 inches. They widened the track another 2 inches. And so the fender flares, blisters get even wider. And they actually weld in shock tower extensions on the front shock struts to get another ½ inch of travel on the front suspension, go to 5-lug wheels. One way to tell the Evoluziones from the earlier ones is the 4 small headlights, whereas the earlier ones had larger headlights on the outer, and then you've got smaller ones on the inner, whereas these have all 4 small headlights. A rear spoiler wing that's adjustable. You can put it into different positions. A wider and deeper hood bulge to accommodate, there's a strut bar and higher shock towers, 2-piston Brembo brakes, and as a result, they win Manufacturers' Championship for the 5th time in a row, which is a new world record. You know, you've got a car, basically the same car, that's won Manufacturers' Championship 5 times in a row. Cancun wins Drivers' Championship for the 2nd time. And so we won 5 times. You know, what more can we do? And Lancia officially retires from racing at that point and says, you know, we've kind of proven our point. There's some corporate stuff going on too. Fiat acquires Alfa Romeo, so there's a lot of reshuffling of where the brands are going. But Lancia essentially says, you know, we're done with racing, but you know, we've proven our point. So they decide to celebrate that, and they build a special edition for the street. They build 400 special edition Martini 5s, which this is number, I believe, 124. Recaro seats in black with red stitching, red seat belts, the Martini striping on the side, and 400 of these are sold to the public to kind of celebrate, hey, we won 5 wins in a row. Nobody else has ever done that. So take that, all you other competitors. And so this example, yeah, number 124, this example has 53 kilometers on it, which is 35 miles. This is a super low mileage car. We, like Doug said, we found this in Chicago. It was sold new in Turin, Italy, and we don't know where it was for probably a decade, but then it popped up on some auctions, mid-teens, 20-teens. Because we've kind of seen it, its track record since then of where it's been. But anyway, this vehicle has 2-liter dual overhead cam, 16 valve, a little over 200 horse, Garrett T3 turbocharger. Top speed is around 136 miles an hour. 0 to 100 or 0 to 62, 100 kilometers, 5.7 seconds, which is still fairly quick. It was top of its game in the early 90s. That was phenomenal for a car like this. You could outdo a lot of far more expensive, you know, racy looking vehicles. This was pretty good in its day. But in 1992, the racing story isn't over. So Lancia retired from racing, but Martini Racing team said, well, we'll manage a team, we'll still race if you just supply cars. Okay, so Lancia supplies vehicles for the 92 season, and guess what? Delta wins for a 6th time in a row the Manufacturers' Championship, and Cancun comes in 2nd for the Drivers' Championship. So 6 times in a row for Lancia Delta. You know, winning 5 was a world record. Winning 6 is a really big deal. And so to celebrate 6 wins, they decide to produce, well, let's produce a Martini 6 edition, and made 310 copies of those. Different striping. You can see here the striping on the Martini 6 has a little dip to it, whereas the one on ours here, the Martini 5, flares out. A couple little differences. The Martini 6 has a blue Alcantara interior, which I don't think is as attractive as the black with the red striping here. But they sold 310 copies of the Martini 6 version. And by now, the Delta is kind of a 14-year-old design. It continues racing the next few years, but it's starting to get dated, and Lancia is officially kind of done with racing. We proved our point, so to speak. So throughout its history, the Delta HF had 46 overall wins, 6 manufacturer wins sequentially, and the Delta's record, I mean, it was still being sold in 1994 to the public, simply because it had a lot of cred in the World Rally circle, and so you were able to sell that for 15 years from when it was launched. You know, whereas VW Golf had gone through, I think, 3 generations by then. You know, and the Delta was still pretty much the same looking vehicle. So Lancia is a 10-time winner of WRC. They won 74, 5, 6, the Stratos, 83, the 037, and then the Delta, 87 to 92. And if you even count that earlier IMC that the Fulvia won, which wasn't an official WRC titled win, that would make 11. They still hold the record for the most wins over any other manufacturer. And, you know, there's a lot of talk, you know, amongst rally fans of Subaru and Mitsubishi today. You know, the Subaru WRX has a lot of, you know, fan followers today. Subaru's only won 3 times. 3 manufacturers wins. Mitsubishi's only won once. Citroën actually has the record right behind Lancia with 8, Toyota 6. Toyota's actually kind of been doing pretty well as of late, the past several years in rally racing today. But Lancia is still the one to beat, and nobody has yet. So we'll see how that goes. And that's been 30 years since they held that record. So nobody's beaten it in 30 years yet. Now, what has Lancia done since then? You know, like I said, most Americans have no clue about Lancia. This was a kind of an executive sports sedan, the Lancia Thema. They also sold an 8.32 version of it with a Ferrari V8 stuffed in the front, driving the front wheels, which is kind of an interesting concept. The Lancia Thesis was mid-2000s, which is kind of an acquired taste in my opinion. The Lancia Delta 3rd generation, which was kind of bland compared to what we're looking at here, I think. And thanks to Fiat Chrysler, the Lancia Thema, which was sold in Europe 2011 to 2014, some of you may recognize that as a Chrysler 300. And the Lancia Voyager, which is sad, essentially a Chrysler Town and Country with Lancia badges on it right there. The interesting thing about this is, and this was a Fiat Chrysler, I don't know, idea that kind of failed, was to merge Chrysler Lancia brands and kind of see what happens. This Chrysler grill launched, this shape here is supposed to represent, which you can see on Chrysler 300s, supposed to represent the Lancia shield somewhat. And most Americans would have no clue about that, you know. Same way with the minivan, you've kind of got that Lancia shield there in those slats superimposed. This is what they're selling today, the Lancia Ypsilon, which is essentially a small 4-door hatchback based on the Fiat 500. It is the only model in Lancia's lineup. We'll see where the future goes. Now that Fiat Chrysler and Peugeot have merged into this entity called Stellantis, Carlos Tavares, CEO of Stellantis, said we are not axing any brands for 10 years. We're going to let each brand come up with a game plan for the next 10 years. And he challenged Chrysler, Dodge, Ram, Jeep, Lancia, Maserati, everybody, saying, you come up with a plan for the next 10 years, and then we'll see where things are. So Lancia's got some plans for the future. We'll see what happens. We'll probably never see it in the US, though, again, but time will tell. And that says the icons of the past are our inspiration for the future. And that was done as a promo for Lancia's next generation. So, any questions? Yes?
Can I get Lancia badges for my Chrysler Pacifica Hybrid?
I don't know. Talk to your Fiat Chrysler dealer and see. I don't know. The weird thing is, so we have a Jeep Renegade, which is made in Italy at a Fiat plant. And when I buy oil filters from the dealer, It comes in a Fiat Lancia box, which is interesting. It's got a Fiat turbo motor in the Jeep Renegade. So yeah, so I always think that's cool that, hey, I buy a filter and it's got a Fiat Lancia logos on the oil filter. So anyway, yeah, I don't know if you can get, yeah.
So Dan, when the company first split up and the mother and the son sold off to Ferrari, the racing program, and then the corporate went somewhere else, when Lancia decided to get back into racing, is that Ferrari's blessing? And is that Ferrari's only jump into rally?
So no, that was, so the Formula One stuff went to Ferrari. Ferrari was also doing stuff at the time, and Ferrari just kind of absorbed Lancia's program and used their D50s. When Lancia got into rallying in the 60s, that was all on their own. It was, they went with the Fulvia, you know, and had great success in. And then when the Stratos came out, and there's a whole, we could spend all day talking about all kinds of weird rabbit trails on this, but the Stratos had a Ferrari V6, and there was a lot of discussion about getting that Ferrari Dino V6. At first, Enzo did not want them to use it, and then they said, well, fine, we'll go to Maserati, which Maserati at that time was not owned by Fiat, but was partnered with Citroën, a French company, and then there was pushback saying, well, we don't want ties to France, so yeah, so anyway, Ferrari finally relented and let them use the Dino V6, even though, you know, Ferrari's controlled by Fiat as well, but Enzo still had a lot of say in what happened. So yeah, but really, you know, Lancia kind of did the rallying on their own, except for that weird little thing with the Stratos using a Ferrari V6.
So besides maybe some power plants, dipping their toes into rally, Ferrari never really got into that.
Ferrari never, I don't think. I'm no rallying expert, and maybe someone else knows better than me, but yeah. Ferrari's more Formula One kind of, yeah, the big players kind of thing. Rallying is probably kind of the equivalent of NASCAR to Americans, you know? It's European NASCAR, I kind of call it, in a way. Whereas Formula One compares more to Indy. Yeah.
I know nothing about road rallying, but how many cars are in a race typically?
I'm no expert again. Quite a few, but they're typically running, you know, they're not all running all at once, you know. You've got timed events and you've got various things, so it's not like big free-for-all demo derby kind of a thing, yeah. And it's typically, a lot of it is off-road, some of it's on pavement. They do rallies all over the world, kind of except the U.S. The U.S. isn't really big on rallying for some reason. It's not our thing.
I was just going to say the closest thing I think we would have would be like hill climb on Pikes Peak.
Yeah, which hill climb at Pikes Peak, I know Audi won 3 years in a row in the 80s, won the hill climb in Pikes Peak, Audi Quattro, which is essentially the same vehicles they're using in World Rally.
Has Lancia ever done that race?
I want to say yes, but I'm not positive. Yes.
You skipped over a model that was apparently kind of an economy version called Appia, and I had an Appia 3. And the weird thing about that is, and you did mention that their V4 was like about 15 inches square.
Right, so
it's a very narrow, like tender
right.
V4. The cylinders kind of.
Yeah. So Lancia's V4. Yeah. So the Appia was essentially a replacement for the Ardea, and then the Fulvia is what replaced the Appia. Yeah, and I didn't even. There's a lot of cars that Lancia did that I didn't include, but the Appia. Again, the four doors had no B-pillar. There was like a coupe version. There was like a Zagato built sports version and stuff. But Lancia's V4 was what you would call a narrow angle V4, where you had one cylinder head covering the entire, all four cylinders, even though you had, you know, the cylinders in a V, which meant that the cylinder bore is not perpendicular to the deck surface. So just like a, those of you that know, like a Chevy 409, 348, or an old, what is it, Ford's 462, 430, I think, is the same design. So to bore it, you can't have a surface-mounted boring block. You've got to have some sort of a jig because it's not perpendicular. So anyway, so the narrow angle V4 has one cylinder head, which is what Volkswagen is doing with what they call their VR6. Volkswagen calls it VR6. R stands for inline, so it's like a combination inline V. You still have one cylinder head covering the whole thing rather than separate cylinder heads.
The other unique thing about that little car is the 4-speed transmission is in the back. It's built in.
Right. Yeah, and that was a Lancia thing too. The Aurelia had that. The Appia had that. I believe the Flaminia had that as well. Yeah, you had the engine up front and the transmission or transaxle in the back to give better weight distribution. Yeah, that was a kind of a Lancia thing too. I mean, other manufacturers have done that as well, but yeah.
And even General Motors copied that once in that car.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Any other questions?
And the rarity of this specific model here in the U.S., the one in California and this one, possibly it.
Yeah, I don't know. So we've discussed this. There was a similar one to this that sold on Bring a Trailer about a year before we acquired this with about the same miles, like around 50 miles on it. It's sold to somebody in California. Rumor has it it might be Leno. Nobody really knows. But yeah, there's probably a few others squirreled away, hidden in all kinds of places in the U.S. You never know. They come out of the woodwork from time to time. Yeah, right here.
Is there any particular reason why this car drew the attention of the museum to purchase a puppy?
I think pretty much like.
It's my fault.
That's a good question. You know, we're always looking for something that's unique that you're not going to see at your normal cars and coffee type event. You know, when Dan proposed this car to our collections committee, so I didn't know a lot about him. I'd seen him, I'd heard about him, I just didn't know a lot of history about him. And once I learned about this car and all the road rally history and the whole Lancia history, it made sense to have something like this. We try to have a very eclectic collection out here, so there's something for all genres, something that touches the heart of everybody that comes in, whether that's an old 1930s car, or whether it's a Lancia, or whether it's a hypercar or something. So this just struck all the right notes for us. And once we saw the car and the rarity of it, you know, we've talked about, if you buy a car with 34 miles on it, you can't drive it, you know, and so we get to look at it and dust it off, but we really can't drive it, or the value will just plummet. It was a very expensive car to buy, but it is an interesting car. It's a fun car to have. But you know, in the future, if we buy cars, you know, we're talking about, let's buy some with a few miles on so we can get out and enjoy them a little bit, you know, let our members enjoy them. So it's pretty keen to look at, and the story behind is fascinating, but maybe we don't buy such limited mileage cars. I want to thank Dan for an excellent presentation, so thank you.